There are guys who will trade, maybe like some bigger money guys that will look at, these gaps and be like, hey, look at this big gap here. It goes from 439 up to 447. This is one day, this is 2 days. It didn't pull back and fill that gap first day, obviously. The second day, it kind of flirted with it, but again, it didn't fill it all the way. But then guess what? It ended up filling that gap perfectly. And what's funny here is, if you're trading this and you're looking at this gap and let's say you're not looking at this gap here, the gap in the chart, well, guess where that price action bounced at? From 446, it pulled right back to the bottom of that gap. It bounced, it filled the gap, and then bounced back to 442. So, there's obviously something to be said about gaps in the chart.
What's up, traders? Cam Hawkins here from Trading Up. We've got Patrick Wieland in the house here. Welcome back to the show, Patrick.
What's poppin'? Let's go. Trading nut. You're a nut, man. This guy's a nut. Gotta get this guy off the camera.
Well, look, guys, we just did an amazing podcast, and you got to listen to this podcast because this guy's getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to trade. So you really want to find out how on earth he does that and all the details around that, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff. There's a link below the video for that. And today we're going to talk about trading gaps. In fact, he's going to jump in a chart in a second and show us how to trade gaps. So over to you, Patrick.
Let's do it. All right.
Folks, if you missed out on joining the Trading Nut Funded Cup, don't worry. With over 3,000 traders registered, my sponsors, City Traders Imperium, have decided to run another. But this time, they've promised the prizes will be even bigger and better. Folks, if you want to register for this and show your skills as a trader, click on the link above or the link below the video or in the podcast description, then sign up for free before 15th of June 2022 and get 10% off any City Traders Imperium product just for entering the competition. Good luck, folks, and we'll see you in the cup.
All right, so we're pulling up the SPY chart. This is the S&P 500, the ETF that we're trading the U.S. for the overall, basically, indices, the market. The SPY is basically following the top 500 companies in the market. The thing about this is every day you got futures. So futures are trading 24 hours a day, except for the little break that they have. But overnight, the market futures moved higher, so we created a gap. The overall stock market stops trading around, I think, like 9 o'clock, 8:45. So we closed last night at the 456 level, and then we pushed up here to a high this morning. We opened up with a gap up at the 457. So we have this whole area in the chart that's just basically a gap in the chart. And there's an old saying in the market that gaps love to be filled. Now, the gaps can also work to the upside or to the downside. So you might have a gap down where the market sells off, and then you have a gap in the chart, and then that same exact gap can get filled back in like a bullish manner. So this morning, we had this big move up here to the 460s. We've got these EMA clouds on the chart that we're looking at that I'm always trading with on TradingView. You can check them out. They're Ripster EMA clouds. I don't think you can get it for free, I'm pretty sure. And it kind of pulls them up there. It's just Ripster EMA clouds if you want to check them out. But we had this move all the way up there to 462. And the first thing that I looked at this morning, obviously we didn't see these candles that were right there. We only saw this big spike up. Well, I'm just looking at this like, hey, look, we got this big old gap in this chart here. Not a massive gap, but still a gap. And what that's telling me is that there's basically this area of price discovery, or just basically the price not really having a lot of volume. No one's really, traded in this area. So there's not like a clear, like, is that support? Is it resistance? But there's just this gap. We don't have information there. So right out of the open, we had this big push up. I ended up getting short buying puts on the overall market. I bought the 460 puts. We were at 461. The market then pulled back all the way down here to 457. Did we get a full, fill in the gap? No, but we did get that momentum that pulled it back to the downside, even though, in the morning, the market rallied, and pushed up to that 462 area. So for most people, they're looking at it like, wow, this thing's going to just keep going higher and higher. But for me, I was pretty much saying there's a good chance that if we can't break to the upside, this thing doesn't keep going, that this thing wants to fill this gap down here and get to that 456 level to fill that gap, which it ended up, kind of touching there multiple times. But you can see later on, it did make that move after getting that double bottom. I think the market, obviously is going to do whatever it's going to do, but it gives me a pretty good idea that right at open, that this big gap in the chart, that gap will get filled at some point, maybe tomorrow, maybe later in the week, the next time the market moves down there, it will fill that gap. If we go back here and we look at a really, really good gap that happened the other day, same idea. Guess what happened? The market rallied. Look at this one from 425 up to a high of 430. So almost a $5 move. So you have a huge gap in the chart, right? I mean, a massive gap in this chart right there. And I don't know about you guys, but if I see this gap in a chart like that, like, because remember, you don't see that price action. But if I see this gap, a $5 gap in that chart, I'm saying, hell, I'm getting short, and I'm going to get short heavy because I think this thing's definitely going to fill that gap here. And guess what? We had a huge gap fill. It pulled back down to that 426 level. But what's really interesting here is, guess what? It filled the gap, and then look where it went, right back up there to that 436 area. So it's not to say that the market was bearish, that it's going to crash, but that gap is just, it's there. Everyone's trading and kind of thinking like that gap has to be filled. And well, guess what? The gap got filled, especially once that support broke. You can see that 15-minute candle, it just dropped like a rock. This was also around some news with the FOMC talking about interest rates and things like that. But in general, it's pretty clear to see that that gap got filled. And once that gap got filled, well, look where it went, right up to that 437 level. So you had a huge move on this. I mean, you had a 2.8% move on that right there, which is insane. I mean, it's a massive move. But if you were buying, let's say you were getting long up here, I mean, you've got 0.79 move there. But especially, seeing that gap in the chart there, definitely very interesting, especially with that price action, because it did push up here, kind of consolidated, and then pulled back and then broke the downside. But pretty obvious to see.
Whereabouts did you get on that one?
This one, I ended up, I think I ended up just getting long on this one once that gap got filled, because I didn't trade this short because of that price action pretty much that day. I think I might have made some trades here, but in general, once this 15-minute candle came back like it did there, I think we talked about on the podcast, that wick, man. Once we see these big wicks, look at that wick on the bottom of that candle. I mean, you had a big drop, and then that wick just pushed right back up. You get that big engulfing candle. I mean, you had selling coming in there. And what's interesting, look at how much selling pressure came in on that candle and pushed it all the way down, but then right back up. And I mean, it was just off to the races on that move. So definitely interesting. And you'll see these gaps. I mean, these happen on again, like, look at this thing. I mean, you had a huge gap up, and then it just sold off all day long, filled that gap. But what's interesting is if you look on that sell-off, I mean, it was basically, from up here at the 430 level, it sold off. And guess what? Once it filled that gap here, what did it do? It bounced. It bounced off 425 back to 427 and then kept going lower. But definitely interesting because, why did it bounce there? Obviously, there was that support there. But in general, you just see how that price action just went.
And on that one there, what was your sort of, how did you approach that one? Because it looks sort of different from the other two.
Yeah, so I don't think I traded this one, to be honest. This was on March 11th. But I do remember this day where it was just nonstop. Like the market just sold. But definitely, it's just interesting to see how the price, you really just got you had a little bit of a balance here. But in general, I mean, it was just, just water falling off until it basically closed that gap. I mean, it's constant. Like you constantly get these gaps. Same thing here. You had a gap in the chart. Guess what? I mean, it pushed up here and filled that gap. I mean, you'll just constantly see gaps in these charts. Same thing here. Boom. Huge gap down. Look how the market gaps down here from that 438 level. It gaps all the way down here to 431 in the morning. And guess what happened? The market rallied right back to the top to fill, that gap there. You had that huge gap in the chart. And look at the price action. I mean, it moved right back up to that 438 level.
And if you're going to have to try and get into that one, what do you think you would have done in that scenario?
For this gap fill, I think your best bet is definitely, you can see on this 15-minute candle here, breaking. This is how I would have traded it, obviously, is if you're looking at this, you have this resistance, you have this push up, you have this pullback, and then you're basically buying this breakout. It's hard. I mean, I think you have to look at maybe the 5-minute on that one, but yeah, you're basically I think for most setups, for me, if I'm going to be trading, I'm looking for breakouts or breakdowns. Like for here was a good example. This one was a really good trade. You had this big, bull flag here, And then I entered once we broke to the downside. Once I get the confirmation, you had 2 dojis, and then we get the price action. Because this is almost like a trap as well, because you can see this candle here, it tried to almost break out, but then this next candle really showed us that, you're going to get that move to the downside there.
It's interesting because in the podcast we were talking about bull flags and how they would, everyone's thinking, right, this thing's going long, but in this case, you're able to spot what was a signifying thing that the breakout and close below that flag was like, nah, this is going to break the other way.
Yeah. Well, because again, remember, it's all emotion. Like we talked about in the podcast, is everybody was sitting there thinking, oh, this is going to break to the upside. So as soon as it broke to the downside, everyone gets stopped out. Everyone rushes to sell, sell, sell. And now you're basically creating almost like false volume there, and maybe almost like kind of a false, I don't know, like, breakdown there. But definitely really, there's so many gaps in this chart. In the overall markets, because the way, the futures are trading 24 hours. So when the SPY opens in the morning, you get these gaps. And look at this one here. You had another just gap, a gap here, and boom, where'd it go? Right. To fill that gap. It's not rocket science. If you see a gap, there's going to be price action around.
You could almost say, well, probably go back and back test it, but you could almost like say, well, I could just trade all those gaps and like expect them to be filled. I'm going to lose a number of trades, but you work out a way to get in.
There are guys who will trade maybe like some bigger money guys that will look at, these gaps and be like, hey, look at this big gap here. It goes from 439 up to 447. This is 1 day. This is 2 days. It didn't pull back and fill that gap first day, obviously. The second day, it kind of flirted with it, but again, it didn't fill it all the way. But then guess what? It ended up filling that gap perfectly. And what's funny here is, if you're trading this and you're looking at this gap and let's say you're not looking at this gap here, the gap in the chart, well, guess where that price action bounced at? From 446, it pulled right back to the bottom of that gap. It bounced, it filled the gap, and then bounced back to 442. So, there's obviously something to be said about gaps in the chart. They happen so much. Again, gap got filled. They just always end up getting filled. And the thing is, obviously, this also really works well for stocks, because this is going to be applied to stocks as well, single stocks. If you have like Apple gaps up big because some news, there's probably a good chance that Apple is going to end up filling that gap at some point. Same thing here. You had a gap down, market rallies back, fills the gap.
Hey folks, ever wonder what broker I use? Well, I use Hanko Trade. It was a no-brainer because I was looking for a broker with good trading conditions and one that wouldn't restrict my leverage. Now, by joining Hanko Trade, I've also cut down my trading costs significantly with their super low commission of just $1 per 100K. You can learn more at hankotrade.com or just click the link I've put in the description. Cool. Awesome. Yeah. Well, look, that's fantastic. Hopefully you guys were able to take a few things away from that. So, Patrick, do you want to wrap up and let the guys know how they can get hold of you?
Yeah, check me out on YouTube. I think you can't miss me, Patrick Wieland. And yeah, the old saying, gaps get filled. Keep an eye on those gaps, my friends.
Cool. Guys, well, look, if you do want to check out that podcast, and I do urge you to because it was awesome, link below the video. Also, remember to hit subscribe, hit like, click on that notifications bell, click all, and you're going to get notified when future videos like this go live. Do remember, if you're trying to get your mindset right, we've got the Genius Traders Club, and if you want to automate stuff, possibly around gaps, then I've got my Robot Builders Club as well. Doors still open for that. We'll see you in the next video.